Hi, everyone. I'm Beth Sadhu, Stagwell's Chief Brand Communications Officer, and we are so happy to welcome you to our virtual CES floor tour for 2023. I understand from some of you in the chat that you couldn't hear the video. We will make sure to play it again at the end for those of you where the sound didn't come through. So we were super excited to be back at CES this year, and our goal for today is to translate the tours that we did on the floor at CES for you at home. So I would love to introduce you to our hosts. Joining me today are Michael Miraflor, Chief Brand Officer for Hannah Gray, which is a venture capital firm that Stagwell is happy to be invested in, and Maggie Malek, CEO of MMI Agency, one of our agencies based in Texas. And Maggie and Michael were on the floor with us in Las Vegas last week, and they are going to expertly guide you through the tour. And so, our goal today really simply is to make sure you feel inspired by what you see. You get some ideas for things you could take back to your job, and even some implications for marketers more broadly. There's a chat function in the Q&A, so feel free to drop a question in there, or you can also shoot us an email, and we'll follow up afterwards. And with that, I will hand it over to Michael.
Hey everyone, audio check. I want to make sure everyone can hear me. I had the pleasure of leading quite a few tours for Stagwell this year, and it was such a pleasure to be back. There were around 115,000 attendees in 2023. So it feels like a big comeback year, especially compared to last year, where only about 40,000 people were able to make it, and a lot of people canceled because of Omicron. There were around 180,000 attendees in 2019, so it definitely feels like a comeback year. It's not all the way back, but we're almost there. And if you didn't attend, I should say that Stagwell had a huge presence at the heart of the show with an active video studio placed right at the center of activity between North and Central Hall. So that was great to see. So what you're going to see over the next 50 minutes or so, or 40 minutes or so, is a condensed version of the floor tours that Maggie and myself gave. We're going to highlight some of the most important themes that we think are most relevant to marketers, but also some of the things that we thought were most interesting in general. So there were 7 major themes that we saw: pragmatism and utility over the fantastical. So some years at CES, there seems to be a lot of innovation for innovation's sake. Because we're coming out of the pandemic and because of the macroeconomic reality, there was a lot of problem solving that was addressed this year. The second major theme is AI is everywhere. Third theme is health tech. We think that's the next frontier for consumer empowerment. The conversation about generative AI and deepfakes definitely made its way onto the CES show floor this year as well. The fifth theme is the robot army. That sounds a bit aggressive. I think this robot army is here to help us, so we're calling it the benevolent robot army. Sustainability in the details. So if there was one through line with nearly every booth and every major installation that we saw, was to address the need for more sustainable needs of doing business and more sustainable needs of production and consumption. And the last major theme with television tech is that it sort of flips, so that instead of focusing on display technology, which is the big headline every year, now it's about the brains, it's about the software, it's about streaming, and it's about empowering consumers to interact with more intuitive UI. So let's focus on the first, pragmatism and utility over the fantastical. So don't get us wrong, there's a lot of whimsy and innovation for innovation's sake all over the show floor, but this year, this CES did feel like brands were solving problems, focusing on utility, which I think, state again, is reflective of the pressure from the state of the macroeconomy and this bear market, but also coming out of the pandemic. I feel like a lot of brands feel responsible for helping consumers come out of it in a way that is more helpful than a hindrance.
Yeah, and I think from a marketing perspective, this is the part that was really exciting to me. While I think CES is awesome, I do feel like a lot of what Michael and I are going to talk about today are solutions to be more efficient, be more effective in your marketing, which is what so many brands are looking for, and it's what consumers want too.
So this first slide is about marrying form and function. So Vuzix is a pioneer in heads-up, heads-free AR smart glasses. They won an innovation award this year for their design. And as you can see, it doesn't even look like a piece of technology, but rather an everyday fashion-forward pair of eyeglasses. It has the ability to beam high-resolution information from a smartphone or a watch. It weighs 38 grams. So it's a great example of technology fading into the background. If you took a look at Vuzix previous iterations of the exact same AR technology, they were bulky, they were big. It's not something that you would want to be caught outside with. So it's interesting to see major technology manufacturers, even those that specialized in enterprise applications such as Vuzix, really care about how organic their technology feels. Another great example is Exgami's. Their projector that is called the Magic Lamp. That's a 3-in-1 that combines a ceiling lamp, projector, and Bluetooth audio speaker. So you would think that there would be major compromises with audio quality, but there isn't. It's Harman Kardon sound system powered. It has various IoT integration options. It's just another example of how the technology form factor is something that major and smaller manufacturers are really paying attention to, because I think the consumer is getting to a place where they're demanding that, especially when you put technology on your face, that it's not obvious. I think we're finally getting to that point, which I think is a good sign and leading indicator, especially from a AR, VR, XR perspective.
Yeah, I think the thing that's really interesting about this one too, to Michael's point, is like all of us have tried to put an IKEA bookshelf together, and it is so difficult. It's near impossible. So imagine the different use cases for this. DIY is currently on the rise. If you were a brand like an IKEA or even a beauty brand, and you could partner with this, upload things, and then your consumers in real time could figure out how to build things, make things faster. So there's just so many cool things that we see as the future of this particular piece of technology.
Yeah, and I mentioned enterprise settings. So think about using this in a medical setting where a surgeon can be beamed vitals information while wearing a version of these glasses, or someone at a warehouse being able to see the location and contents of what is in a pallet or a box amongst thousands in a giant warehouse. But it's not all enterprise. I mean, imagine being able to play a game like Pokemon Go, which right now is played through smartphone devices in AR, but through glasses, whether it be Vuzix or whether it be Magic Leap or whether it be what Apple is rumored to be coming out with in a couple of quarters. I know we've been talking about AR and XR for a while, but I think it's closer than ever, and we're seeing the form factor really speak to generating consumer demand for such experiences. Going to the next slide, I have to admit, this is a bit more on the whimsical side. So Block on the left, and I think there's going to be a video playing. Yeah, there is. It's the Peloton of the kitchen. So it's a smart cutting board with an integrated video stream. So if you can imagine, live and on-demand cooking classes can be accessed on that screen. I mean, something that I have taken as a New Year's resolution is to start cooking more at home. And I've been looking for different ways to, place an iPad or a smartphone right next to my cutting board when I'm going through the motions. And again, it's a bit whimsical, but it's interesting to see how cheap the components are to integrate into something like a smart cutting board to make it accessible to consumers that can provide some practical functionality in terms of maybe there's a feature in ad-sponsored free classes and cooking classes. On the right side is an Aegis Rider AR-enabled motorcycle helmet. This company is headquartered in Switzerland. It's yet another example of a lot of technology. It's now commodity technology, but really a lot of the components came out of the smartphone era, so they're very cheaply manufactured and put together. This helmet provides a heads-up display that can provide directions, ride statistics, and highlights. You can't tell that this helmet is injected with so much technology from the outside looking in, but once you put it on as a consumer and as a rider, again, it's all about safety. It's all about integrating multiple components into something that looks and feels organic, or it doesn't look like you're wearing a huge piece of robotics on your head. One of the big announcements that Sony made this year, in addition to, they also introduced a car, which is another big story that we might talk about towards the end. They released for the first time and allowed conference goers to play with PSVR 2, which is going to be released in about a month's time. Very impressive technology specs, wide field of vision, 4K video beams into each eye. Cost is below $600. It does require a PS5. So unlike a Meta Oculus Quest 2, you still need to have the horsepower inside of a PS5 powering this thing. But it started this conversation on the show floor around if this is going to be the year that VR really breaks through. I think VR is one of those major topics that is revisited every year at CES. And every year, the conversation ends with, let's wait for next year. I think Meta Oculus Quest 2 is a great example of a standalone piece of hardware, but I think with Sony added into the equation, there's a good chance of AAA game software manufacturers and, publishers, and also developers of more utilitarian software getting into the mix. So I think, and maybe Maggie, feel free to agree or disagree, I think this coming holiday season, I don't want to call it a make or break, but it's definitely going to decide the fortunes of VR as a scaled consumer technology.
Yeah, definitely. I think the thing to always think about with these things is something that Michael keeps saying is like innovation for the sake of innovation or tech for the sake of tech. One of the things I still saw at CES is that, some consumers are still skeptical of VR and AR. I think if we're looking at this holiday season as being make or break, thinking about consumers leading the way, how do you target younger consumers who are going to be pumped about something like this versus somebody like me who has been watching TV or consuming content the same way. The other thing that Michael and I kind of talked about on the floor too is eventually there's going to be an awesome overlap between something like a Vuzix and something like this. So maybe it'll feel a little less bulky, but you're still getting that same experience. And how can you take it outside of your house?
Yeah, and once again, it's the same every CES. And for those of us who have VR headsets at home, it's just one of those experiences that is so specific to the device that you really need to try it out in order for you to really experience what is capable on those devices in a way that's very difficult to verbalize. So as Maggie just said, I think as the form factor continues to become less bulky, as the quality of software improves, and as these brands find better ways for consumers to sample prior to purchasing, I feel that VR has a chance. But I think it's worth noting that if you rewind 5 to 7 years ago, there was still a debate whether AR, like the example that we showed in Vuzix and also things like Magic Leap, would become scaled consumer devices. And a lot of people are still arguing, yes, it will be a consumer device as much as it is an enterprise device. I think AR is mostly swung towards enterprise. So that might leave room and white space for VR to become the consumer sort of next generation viewing device. But again, I think that the holiday season might show where the fortunes of VR lies for the next decade or so. Next slide. To continue the conversation about immersive media, there was quite a bit of conversation as well around haptics. So if you're not familiar with haptics, imagine you wearing a pair of VR, XR, or AR goggles and being able to physically feel in real life what you're experiencing in virtual space. So let's say, for example, you're playing a boxing game and you have on a haptics vest, which is something that bHaptics, this company, showed off in the Metaverse Zone at CES. If you get punched in the chest, I mean, there's a visceral feeling that you get from seeing that visually, but imagine that you actually feel that. Or imagine that you are in a firefighting training simulation. There's a few municipalities across the country that are utilizing a combination of VR and XR to do that sort of training. And imagine feeling you handling a hose or an axe, or maybe even feeling heat. That is the future of a lot of what the R&D behind the scenes at places like Magic Leap and related companies like bHaptics are investing in to make those experiences even more immersive. Now, is that what's going to unlock AR or VR at scale? Not quite sure, but it is very impressive. It's one of those things that you have to actually put on an experience at CES to get the full effect, but it was impressive enough for us to talk about now. And I think Maggie can agree that, adding more senses to the AR, VR, XR experience can go a long way in exciting consumers about the possibility of these technologies.
No, 100%. That's very true.
And moving on to the next slide. So Arbion, they introduced AR social media for the first time, quote unquote, at CES 2023. They're from South Korea, and I think the easiest way to explain this without experiencing it firsthand is imagine a social network that allows you to comment on things, to rate things, to communicate with friends that also belong to the social network, but it is invisible to everyone who doesn't have the application installed on their smartphone or devices in which you could experience this AR social media network. So, for example, from a Yelp perspective, imagine going to a restaurant and you triggering this Arbion experience, and you are able to see by looking into a menu what other people have said about the individual food items. So like, I don't want to say a next generation Yelp, but it certainly feels like that. And I think there are massive implications when it comes to retail. I don't think this is going to be a technology that's going to scale massively in short order, but the technology does exist. So we're going to see attempts by Arbion and beyond, maybe by some more familiar names from a domestic social media perspective.
I think the other kind of very real world application too, and I completely agree with Michael, like I could see like a Target or somebody buying something like this, like Target buying it or Yelp or even Pinterest. If we think about the experience of like a prestige buying experience versus like a mastige, imagine if you walked in Target and you could scan different things and get recipe ideas or blogger ideas, or then you're walking through the beauty aisle and somebody's telling you what products go with what, and it's very brand agnostic. Imagine bringing that prestige feel into normal retail spaces, making that more accessible. I think that will also drive up sales for retail things as well too. So this was honestly like one of my favorite ones I saw, just because I could think of so many different areas of the consumer journey and path to purchase across industries where this would fit.
Yep. Thanks, Maggie. Okay, AI everywhere. So I think, depending on the year, there are waves of trends that can sometimes feel like a logo slap. I remember there were a couple of years, I think it was 2016, 2017, where Alexa and Google Home had logos everywhere. Like anyone who could integrate that API was showing it off. I think this year, AI was literally everywhere, and it took a little bit of effort to figure out what was real and had real marketing implications versus people who are claiming to have AI or having very rudimentary AI. I think from a marketing perspective, there's so much conversation revolving around ChatGPT and AI that essentially supercharges the ability of creatives and writers and researchers to get things done. We just extrapolated a couple of examples here. One is a bit whimsical, the other is very practical, but I think showcases the range of what AI we saw on the show floor. So this is called Box Tech. It's a contactless alcohol vending machine, claims to be the first of its kind. Obviously, there are a lot of rules and regulations and laws that prevent vending machines from serving alcoholic beverages. First and foremost, the need to check ID. So what this technology promises is that a user pulls out their ID, puts it into the machine then uses AI computer vision to scan the person's face while they're standing in front of the vending machine to validate that it is the actual person for whose over 21 ID is inserted in the machine. So it's not the most complicated or multi-layered expression of AI, but it is interesting in that it solves a problem. I think we can call it a problem. I'm not sure if it's more of an opportunity than a problem. I think what they said on the show floor is that it takes an average of 15 minutes to get an alcoholic beverage at a bar versus the 60 seconds that this AI computer vision can use to cross-reference your government ID or driver's license to serve you in a vending machine. So it's interesting. I think it's more on the whimsical side, but I think we can say that this is practical. You can apply this to anything else that is age-gated, I think, and goes to show how commoditized and therefore available and affordable a lot of the componentry that's needed to integrate into a system like this. The AI isn't super advanced, but it's complicated enough to get our interest in former Oakland Raiders players investing in such technology to see if they can attempt to scale it.
As a former bartender, what I told Michael is I can guarantee no amount of AI is going to make a better martini than your bartender that you waited a minute for. So this is one of those problems that I questioned a lot, but it was fun to talk about.
I say give it some time. It's only a matter of time before robots can make a superior martini. Okay, I think this one is on the other side of the spectrum, and it's a bit more pragmatic. So Infinique is a company that focuses on computer vision and their data science algorithms to provide a service layer for autonomous driving, but also retail. I'm not sure how many of us have experienced Amazon Go, but if you go into an Amazon Go store, they already have your purchase information. You pull something off the shelf, you walk right out the store, and without any human intervention or your need to line up and check out, it automatically debits your card. That is powered by a ton of cameras and sensors inside of those owned and operated locations. For those retailers outside of the Amazon ecosystem, Infinique is one of those vendors that provides that layer of technology. But what we thought was most interesting is that their computer vision software is also used for personal identification anonymization. So if you can see from this photo, they had a demo that, again, it's one of those very many things at CES that you had to kind of experience it to get the full effect. But it automatically blurred anyone's face who is passing by. Furthermore, and I wish we had a video of this, but if you clicked for a filter, it actually retained the anonymization algorithm, but instead of your face being blurred out, it would just be a slightly modified version of your face, I should say. And this sort of technology, I think, will have massive implications on the fact that we live in a surveillance-powered world with cameras everywhere, whether that surveillance is intentional or not. They're dealing with this in the EU right now, where because of GDPR, it is literally illegal to even accidentally pick up things like faces in public or license plates on vehicles that you might just have passing by a stationary camera. There needs to be, and I'm not sure if this is going to be an ad tech or MarTech solution, but with CCPA and CPRA being something that will scale nationally in short order, we feel like technologies like the one that Infinique is offering, and they're not going to be the only ones, obviously there are going to be a bunch of them, that are going to be required when these anonymization or these personal identification laws are put into place and enforced.
Yeah, I think the idea around protecting PII and the fact that faces are now becoming a part of this conversation, and we'll get into health tech in a second, is really important. There are so many implications to all of these technologies that we'll talk about from a targeting standpoint, from a reaching standpoint, but again, just that PII, personal identification information, it makes our marketing smarter. Does it protect us as humans? And so this, again, is another innovation that I think is really amazing in terms of giving marketers more data and brands more data, but also going that extra mile and really protecting consumers as well.
But also, Maggie, this is something that we talked about on the show floor. The accuracy by which you could calculate things such as footfall in real time.
If we think about like how we all have to wait for Nielsen and MMMs when it comes to retail sales, that is the most, I swear, painful part of some of our jobs in what we do in tracking our consumers. So this is going to give you much more real-time data to see what are people buying, where are they doing self-checkout, what else was in their cart, all of those things. Again, yeah, Michael, while still protecting the people doing the buying.
Exactly. Okay, moving on to the next section, health tech. A lot of health tech this year was about consumer empowerment, was all over the North Hall. I would say that, or I would guess that a majority of us on this call through the pandemic have experienced a reliance on telemedicine, and we saw plenty of examples on the show floor that felt like, a direct-to-consumer or at-home version of health. And I think it's reflective of a real tremendous paradigm shift that we're seeing when it comes to the evolving relationship between doctors and patients. One of the more interesting stats that we studied up on going into this year's CES was that the Office of Economic Development released new figures that stated that the number of doctors per capita has actually fallen to something around 2.6 from around 2.7 in just a couple of years. So going back to the pragmatic take that a lot of companies brought to CES this year, we saw a lot of that, especially in health tech with consumer empowerment. So going to the next slide, this was one interesting example. So Vivu is a company that through computer vision provides the ability for a user to take an at-home urine test when coupled with the app, which is powered by a user smartphone that takes advantage of a computer vision algorithm that can decode something on a strip of paper that one urinates on to determine things like hydration level, magnesium, calcium levels, ketone levels, sodium, protein in 90 seconds or less. It's meant to be really user-friendly. I tried this. They were giving out free samples. I got those readings within 90 seconds. It told me that I was severely dehydrated, as one is in Las Vegas during CES, so I can say that's fairly accurate. But this is something that a small handful of companies were experimenting with when it came to the ability to leverage computer vision AI to decode something that was urinated on. So there were toilets. There were another company called Withings, who is another biometric, like at-home kind of goods company, also experimenting with this technology as well. And these are readings that would usually require you to go to a doctor's office or a clinic or maybe even take a blood test. So the fact that these readings can be turned around in 90 seconds or less is massively impressive. And we saw pretty good crowds around this booth. Going to the next slide. A Cradle is really interesting. And I think this goes back to that red thread at the beginning of this presentation about technology kind of like fading into the background, feeling a bit more organic, but also the thread of having really practical implications. So this technology, the way it works is two users put their palms on each side of this object, looks like wood, looks like it's something that's beautifully crafted. And its intention is so that once you have both hands on this object and touch each other's skin, it closes a circuit that stimulates both parties and allows for communication to be made with someone who otherwise can't communicate conventionally. So the manner and the intensity of touch translates into different sounds. So different ways of touching conveys different meanings and intentions. It's meant to be used by people with dementia or people that are suffering from autism or mental disabilities or visual impairments that aren't able to communicate using their voice. So we thought this was interesting for a few reasons. First and foremost, that it's not an intimidating piece of technology, and it does serve a real purpose for when there is a lack of mode of communication between two parties in a medical setting.
Yeah, and it's also, it's also beautiful. It's something that I think that like kind of stood out for us because everything else looks very techy, and that looks like art.
Yep. Very quickly, because I know that, okay, we're pacing well on time, so we'll keep on going. Endo AI is a computer-aided polyp detection system to remotely assist doctors in reviewing endoscopy imaging. This is yet another example, although this is not an at-home example, it's an example of a technology that's leveraging computer vision, AI, and the ability to take advantage of, in this case, in excess of 200,000 images in a database to aid doctors who might be providing care from remote locations. So again, that idea of disintermediating the need to go to a doctor's office or maybe to provide care in geographic areas that make it really difficult to access a doctor, and to be able to use a mountain of training data to be able to diagnose something way more quickly than what technology affords us now is something that we saw all over the show floor in different ways, shapes, or forms. Going to the next slide, the MedWand If you're a fan of Star Trek, this might remind you of Dr. McCoy's like tricorder. So it's a real-time examination platform. It kind of looks like a big computer mouse that when you wave it over someone's forehead for less than 60 seconds, it provides live monitoring, remote clinical grade vitals capture. So from this image, you can see that it is a combination thermometer, stethoscope, EKG heart monitoring. It has a pulse oximeter, so you can measure blood oxygen levels, electrocardiogram. So it is an example of an expression of a technology that really serves the purpose of clinical care everywhere, as MedOne Solutions had mentioned in their presentations and their demonstrations. So to erase geographical barriers for care, it is something that is FDA cleared, and their purpose, and this technology has been around for a couple of years, but it's really interesting to see them kind of pivot their messaging into, they made a big announcement at CES this year about Urban Rural Healthcare Alliance membership in collaboration with AT&T, HP, and Oracle to increase the availability of this technology to be used to provide equitable medical services to, again, places that might not have, places where patients might not have access to elite medical care. So it's a combination, again, of amazing technology that literally didn't exist a decade ago, and maybe in previous iterations of CES would have been shown off just technology for technology's sake, but they took the extra step of making sure that the technology has a chance to scale because the purpose is there, and also the demand from consumers, because we've gotten used to this type of remote medical care throughout the pandemic. The demand will only grow over time.
Well, and also, Michael, it's really interesting too, the partnerships they already have, the AT&Ts, the HPs, the Oracles. I feel like that also lends some credibility, but also consumer trust. Like a lot of these healthcare ones we're going to talk about are, they could be perceived as, startups. They are startups. But this one is a bigger one, and it has bigger partners and it's backing. So I feel like they're going to be baked in thinking about some of the HIPAA things they need to think about with a partner like an AT&T.
Absolutely. And speaking of HIPAA, that's a great transition to the next slide.
I'm here for you.
Another interesting company that caught our attention, or caught our eye, was IQ Vision Check. So their smartphone-powered device, which costs less than $100, claims to replace the need to go to an eye doctor for a new prescription. If you're someone like me, I'm like 4 months overdue having to schedule an appointment to the eye doctor to get a new prescription. IQ is claiming to have their technology basically, again, disintermediate that need. It's low cost. It can be used by an entire family. It uses a combination of precision optics, AI, and machine learning to generate as accurate results as you going to an eye doctor and going through all of the standard tests. They announced at CES that they're HIPAA compliant. So their cloud-based IQ Connect platform links doctors and patients together. I think this is fascinating. Also, I think that the commercial arrangements that they had halfway announced, and I think will roll out throughout the rest of the year, that are attempting to sort of vertically integrate the entire experience so that at the end of doing an at-home eye check, you can also order a pair of glasses in a very Warby Parker-esque sort of way. I mean, I think this is really fascinating, and the fact that it is already low cost and has yet to scale has pretty dramatic implications on this particular healthcare sector, but is yet another example of rapid development of technology using componentry that has already existed from the smartphone ecosystem to, in combination with AI and machine learning algorithms, can really solve problems for consumers in a very purposeful way. And the last slide in the health tech section, we saw a bunch of sleep tech, a ton of sleep tech. I know that a lot of us in the audience, we might have tracked our sleep through something like an 8Sleep mattress, or I have a Whoop band, and I also have an Apple Watch. I think it's a very interesting trend that we saw starting this year that I feel like will carry on to CESs in the future, where biometric tracking of very specific sleep patterns and sleep metrics without the need of on-person wearables is something that we saw quite a few, mostly Asian companies, introduce ecosystems for. So componentry that could detect sleep stages in any environment using microphone-based equipment as asleep, to the left here, showcased. So instead of wearing something on your body, you would put one of their devices alongside your nightstand, for example, and the sensors and the microphones on that particular device would be able to track movement, to track your heart rate. Interesting API announcement that they debuted as well, linked one's sleep tracking metrics to the opportunity to link to commerce. So although I don't think it's right around the corner, but there are implications there for, I think we were talking about this earlier in our run through this presentation. One of their examples was if it tracks that, if this ecosystem tracks that you're getting subpar sleep throughout the week, it might offer you, a discount on an eye cream or an under eye cream or something like that. Yeah. Or maybe it's to over-the-counter medication that can help you get a better night's sleep. I think it's also worth noting that a lot of these sleep technologies and ecosystems that were being introduced at this year's CES did not yet have API or data relationships with any of the big American tech companies like Google, Amazon, or what have you. And it'll be really interesting to see in years to come whether some of these companies that were introduced at CES this year get acquired, if there's partnership, what sort of HIPAA regulations will have to be overcome, what kind of integration into pre-existing health data ecosystems we're going to see. So I think this is an interesting area to keep an eye on when it comes to health tech, because there was just so much of it commanding square footage on the show floor in a way that we hadn't seen prior.
Yeah, and I definitely think that closing with that section with the sleep one is it's interesting, because if you look at, like Michael was talking about at the top of this section, like people are taking healthcare more into their own hands than ever before. We see from a consumer behavior standpoint, health-related searches are completely through the roof. And 2022 was actually the year of the worst sleep. I can send everyone a study on that. And so human beings, like, we are fascinated. We are wanting more and more data to understand our bodies. Why are we sad? Why are we restless? All of these things. And so as you think about these things slowly even connecting in smarter ways than ever before, empowering you for a better life, a better lifestyle, that's not just something that needs to slap on your wrist, the targeting can get so much smarter. So I think that's what's fascinating about this whole section.
Yeah, and the example on the right very quickly, the Stop Snoring Smart Motion Pillow, it's an example of, I think sleep tech prior was a lot of, it felt very like biohacky, or a lot of the quantification of self-movement. I think it's evolved, so something like the Stop Snoring Start Motion Pillow, it's meant to, in addition to help you stop snoring, it can identify things like sleep apnea and provide data to your healthcare provider to help you gauge how that is being treated over time. So that's definitely, as Maggie said, I think this is something that we should keep an eye on moving to the future, especially as it relates to commerce opportunity on top of the health implications. All right, moving on to generative AI and deepfakes. I think this is a topic that has obviously commanded a lot of conversation internally at our respective brands and agencies. Everything from ChatGPT to Midjourney to DALL-E 2, it's massively impressive on the surface, but CES gave us an opportunity, because of a couple of examples that we came across on the show floor, to really make us think about not only the commercial implications, but also the moral implications of using these technologies, and even going all the way to like having very existential ad hoc discussions about if some of this technology should even exist. But I think, in a nutshell, to sum it all up, I think the technology is already here, and in lieu of regulations to stop it, it's only going to increase, and it's only going to be made more available in an intuitive way, and the processing power is so cheap from a cloud perspective that It's something that we can't ignore or maybe even recommend incorporating into our creative workflows. So we're going to talk about a few examples that we saw. And I will head this off by saying that I feel like we're in the first inning of generative AI, and don't want to focus too much on deepfakes because that has a negative connotation, but we're in very early days. So even the technologies that we're going to talk about in these next few slides will evolve very quickly over the next year. So Storyfile has, focusing on this slide, Storyfile has a product called Conversa that is essentially using AI in the form of video to replace chatbots, written FAQs, explainer videos. It allows brands to do basic Q&A, corporate training, online education. Right now, this technology requires an actual human to be captured for, let's say, 15 minutes of time and maybe 5 minutes of spoken language for it to pick up enough of the intonation, enough of the cadence, enough of the personality for the generative AI system to kind of slap together a very human looking, or based on a real looking or a real human avatar that can approximate maybe to the 80th percentile interacting with an actual human. I think that before long, definitely within this year, companies like Storyfile will claim to be able to take a wide berth of general information and to use that as training data to accomplish the same task of approximating human interaction by way of virtual avatar. So for example, if Maggie uploaded maybe 5 minutes worth of video of herself through different angles, not even for the purpose of generating a Q&A avatar, but just, in general, and maybe recordings of her voice, and maybe injecting her social media feeds, or maybe it's a blog or something of that nature. Storyfile or a company like it will be able to take that amalgamation of data and form or produce an avatar that is able to have a conversation that could serve as, a front of house kiosk for, hotel check-in, or at a restaurant, or in the case of this Conversa product, to be used anywhere online, just to make any sort of written communication or information more accessible and more, vibrant or human. The next example is from a couple of companies that are in direct competition with each other, Proto and Art. I don't think these photos do it justice, but these are examples of holographic communication devices. They can run pre-recorded content, but they can also live stream interactive real-time conversations. So it looks like these are people trapped in boxes, but they are actually holographic renderings of humans that are being captured in real time. So if you think about what is a Zoom conversation, but 100 times better, that actually to the 97th percentile tricks your brain into thinking that you're actually in the room present with the other person. Just thinking about what the implications of that sort of technology can do, other than it being massively technologically impressive. I think Art is one of the companies that over the years I've seen make its way from the basement of CES all the way to the main show floor, not only because it is technologically impressive, but because now in a post-pandemic world, it's become a bit of a practical solution for things like, I don't know, instead of having to travel halfway around the world on a commercial flight with all of those environmental implications and time implications, you being able to show up as a hologram and having the quality of that conversation be just as good as you being there in person. I think that's something that we can, start to think about as the technology shrinks and becomes more available and more accessible.
Yeah, the other use case that Michael and I heard about from somebody that was actually on one of our floor tours, I thought this was so cool, is somebody wasn't able to attend a wedding and they had the hologram bridesmaid show up. And again, this is not AI. This is not a fake. It's like you're where you are being filmed, and then you're hologrammed in, and it was a surprise for the wedding. And it was just the most like beautiful, cool, but like poignant real world story. I think I had heard of some of these things. So I loved that.
Yeah, it's one of those things that when you encounter, you just can't believe that the technology is good enough to trick your brain. And even if you're actively thinking, like, this is not a person in front of me, it's just so good that I can see this standing in for, I mean, I'm one of those people that works from home most of the time. I'm not saying that I would want my boss to beam in as a holograph to be able to check in with me.
Oh God, everyone would hate me at MMI. I'm just gonna show up in your room.
But we're seeing examples of this, already being talked about in terms of having people testify in court. I mean, there are obviously a lot of legal implications to talk about. There are a few companies, including Sun Life Financial Services, who have used this technology to give quarterly earnings reports to key constituents and investors. And the Crown Prince of Dubai used this to deliver an address at the World Government Summit. So it's already being used for halfway practical purposes. Now, what happens when this technology becomes accessible enough to place in office conference rooms, for example? I just think it's 1,000 times better than a Zoom call when it comes to creating that feeling of emotional connectivity or just presence with someone else in the room. And I know that issues of productivity and conversations about hybrid work and work from home are things that are unavoidable. So this is one of many examples that we saw on the show floor of trying to practically address those issues. It seems fantastical, it seems whimsical, it feels inaccessible, but in very short order, we've seen this technology evolve where, I don't know, I wouldn't be that surprised that in 2 or 3 years we see this in more places. Now, the next slide is one where during our show floor tours, and I think we can skip the video. We'll just talk about it.
This was an existential debate on the show floor with me and Michael.
And a lot of people, a lot of our friends from brands and agencies who are able to tag along with us on our tours. But a company called Deep Brain AI has a product. It's one of a few products that they have. This is the most provocative one. So when there was a lot of mention about Black Mirror technology on the show floor, and this is one of those examples that is straight out of a couple of episodes of Black Mirror and what it claims to be able to do, and that is through generative AI, allow you to recreate in a very conversational way presence with someone in the same room. With this person may have departed this world or have been deceased. So imagine you being able to have an active, evergreen conversation with a deceased loved one. Now, that is the goal of this Rememory product. So going back to what I said earlier about being able to make available information, whether it be private or public, so social media feeds, photos, videos, maybe a diary, or any information that you are able to capture before the person is deceased, like from their person, or any personal information that you make available to the algorithm to have it approximate in a very realistic human feeling avatar way an ongoing conversation. Obviously, it has massive implications on what this technology is able to do, but it's already here. And what we saw at CES are very early versions of what the goal really is, which is to essentially be able to have conversations with deceased loved ones for now and ever. Now, is that something that should exist? It's became like a bit of a debate, and I think it touched upon a bit of a spiritual conversation for some people. Yes. But from a commercial perspective, it also demands a bit of an exploration into, okay, what does this mean for influencer campaigns, right? What does it mean for name, image, and likeness rights for celebrities, right? There was a rumor a couple of months ago where it was rumored that Bruce Willis, because he is in health decline, sold his virtual rights to a private equity firm or something. And it was completely believable, and a lot of outlets reported on it before it was debunked. But it was believable because it's possible, given the technology that exists from a generative AI perspective and an avatar perspective. But no one's really figured it out yet from a commercial perspective. So I think it's wide open. I think that the conversation around what is possible with generative AI, let's take it down quite a few notches from trying to recreate being in the same room as a deceased loved one, but things like copywriting, things like image generation, the labor that is currently required and the value chain of software solutions that are required to produce creativity. I think the real potential here, because I know that it's a scary thing to talk about, and it's very intimidating because it can go in any direction, but I really feel like we're going to be encountering creative tools that will allow creative professionals to raise the bar and raise the ceiling on the quality of creative that can be produced. Versus, I think what we're focusing now is the floor for creativity being raised for everyone, which is in a very practical way that's very democratizing. Like you or I, even if we're not copywriters, we could start to generate incredible copy or write articles, at the drop of a hat because of things that currently exist. But what is going to happen when we start encountering technology that's going to allow actual creative professionals to create things that we can't even imagine?
I know we only have 5 minutes left, so I'll be like super fast on this point, but I think that is a very interesting implication. I think one of the things we've been playing with ChatGPT and other things a lot is AI is just like any kind of creative. It's only as smart as the information that you give it. And so that is where I think there is still leaps and bounds to go. But I also think one of the things, and we know this from the advertising industry, that once upon a time we kind of broke consumer trust because we were like forcing ads down everybody's throat. So it's interesting when you think about AI and these AI influencers and all of that. How do we make sure that we use this technology in a smart way so that we don't break trust with consumers, so that when people think they're dealing with a real person, it's actually a real person or a real influencer and all of that. So I think, again, what's fascinating about all of these is there are so many legal and moral implications. It's like the Jurassic Park quote, like, just because we can, does that mean we should? That's kind of what I left CES thinking about and poking. Michael and I talked about it so much as we were doing all these floor tours.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say about deep brain AI is that it's being utilized by a couple of major networks in South Korea, where a portion of their nightly news broadcast is being read by avatars. Now, these broadcast stations are choosing, there are no laws or regulations, but they're choosing to put an indicator in the corner of the screen to inform viewers that the news that's being read to them is being performed by a non-human. Like they've decided to take that step. So I think with every new use of AI, whether it be to generate an avatar or to write copy or to generate images, in lieu of there being any laws or rules or regulation or industry standards, I think the onus is on us to decide how transparent we should be, to Maggie's point, with consumers and customers. All right, we have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to speed through the next couple of sections. The robot section, if we can go to the next slide, there were basically 3 different types of robots that we saw on the show floor. There were industrial robots, so those are the type that are really helpful at doing things that would otherwise be dangerous situations for humans, like cleaning up the nuclear waste at Fukushima, for example. We saw an interesting increase in the number of robots that were directly meant to address labor force issues, so providing predictable, stable labor in industries where humans no longer want to participate to the same degree, or where the pandemic has taught us that even a slight disruption can ripple through the supply chain. So a lot of worker robots, front of the house and back of the house. And lastly, and I think most importantly, are companion robots. So in Western industrialized countries specifically, there are flat or negative birth rates. I think we're less than a couple of decades away from there being a real question of who is going to take care of all of our elderly. Combine that with the fact that this past couple of years aside, we're living longer than ever. So we saw a lot of practical expressions of robots that are meant to be companions to either the elderly or to be helper robots for everyday at-home usage. So Aeolus Robotics, just a couple of seconds on this, is a prime example of a caretaker robot that looks like a humanoid because over time, I think that consumers will start to expect robots to feel and look like humans at home. Interesting anecdote is that over the years, CES has featured robots of different shapes and sizes, and when humanoid robots started showing up a few years ago, there's a bit of a backlash. People felt uncomfortable around them, but as the explanation and as the narrative of humanoid robots need to exist to be caretaker robots, to kind of be less intimidating, we've seen it be a non-issue, especially this year with the amount of caretaker robots that we have seen that look and feel like this Aeolus robot. A couple of other examples. I'm going to focus on the barista robot. It is an interesting front of the house robot example of, there are a lot of issues with, especially coming out of the pandemic, but they're lingering issues with labor force commitment, motivation, people showing up on time, not being able to find enough hourly wage staff at QSR locations. So just a month and a half ago, McDonald's introduced its newest format that really minimized human interaction or the need for multiple humans to really operate that location. If any of you live in New York, you might have been to what's the coffee chain that I'm thinking about, where it is basically meant to reduce, and Starbucks is doing this as well, to minimize the need for humans to operate the coffee chain. This is an example, Blank Street Coffee is what I'm thinking about. This is an example of a robot that takes it one step further. So a lot of QSR formats are doing a lot of this automation back of the house. They're trying to be as efficient as possible, not be reliant on an hourly wage labor force. It's uncomfortable to talk about, and it's kind of uncomfortable to think about because we are talking about, humans and the labor force, but it's very practical, and these boardroom conversations, especially in the restaurant and QSR space, are actively happening right now. Sustainability, and are we okay going a few minutes over, or should I speed through this, or?
I think you can keep going, Michael.
Okay.
I know a couple people have to drop, but I think for those who are interested, carry on, and we appreciate everyone's time.
Thanks, Beth. So talking about sustainability, sustainability has not been a major focus of CES in the past. Like we mentioned, a lot of previous years of CES have focused on innovation for innovation's sake, a lot of specs, a lot of focus on the hardware. Sustainability, however, became a major topic of conversation in even the most likely of booths. In fact, sustainability became the topic of conversation in the television space, we'll get to. John Deere was a primary example of this, where John May, the CEO of John Deere, was quoted in saying in his keynote speech that technology is the solution to challenges having to do with less rural labor, less arable land, and less time to address especially because of what's going on in between Russia and Ukraine. I think there were a couple of months where globally there was a real concern about global food supply. John Deere has taken up the task of showcasing at this year's CES the combination of their hardware manufacturing capability and leadership, and marrying that with technology and AI to really showcase how, even in the absence of there being a growing workforce that is willing to do this very manual labor, that there is technology that does exist and is being worked on that over the next decade will help to specifically address food shortage and food production problems. So ag tech is something that became a huge topic of conversation this year that we thought was really interesting. From a TV perspective, I mentioned that previous iterations of CES would focus a lot on the hardware. So over the past decade, it has always been a four-way fight between Samsung and Panasonic and Sony and LG for who has the best TV technology. This year was pretty interesting that Samsung didn't show off their new TVs at the convention center. Rather, they had it set up in a more intimate manner on the strip. But they focused their messaging at the show floor almost entirely on lifestyle and sustainability, which is really interesting. Sony, in fact, didn't introduce any new television sets in their booth. And we saw with Panasonic is another great example where they unveiled a plan to reduce emissions to net zero by 2030. Going back to Samsung, they had announced a partnership with Patagonia to reduce the amount of microplastics that were introduced into the water supply when washing certain types of garments. So in both a messaging and marketing perspective, but also in a very functional hardware R&D driven way, we saw a lot of, I wouldn't say they're necessarily unlikely, because we have seen more of a environmental conversation happening over time, but to see it show up center stage as the primary conversation, especially surrounding a brand like Samsung, where people have come to expect the gigantic TV displays, I think really says something for, CES here on out. So I think this is a leading indicator of the types of conversations that will surround CES moving forward. And lastly, last but not least, television technology. I think we've sort of flipped where I've already mentioned a couple of times, the conversation is less about how impressive the screen technology is and how impressive the display technology itself is, but now it's all about the operating system, it's about the software, it's making things even more intuitive and accessible for consumers. And I think this is the year where the conversation from the technology manufacturers is focusing pretty specifically on the streaming experience. So if we consider that linear has always been, even if consumer behavior has been changing dramatically over the past decade, especially over the past 5 years or so, the conversation about streaming is now being led by technology manufacturers, which has not been the case in previous CESs. And again, we're seeing LG not focusing on, even though they had a very dramatic television display, they focused a lot on developments in their web OS interface, and a lot of the innovation that they showcased with their at-home appliances was from more of like a lifestyle perspective or a customization perspective versus hard technology improvements. I think they, as well as Samsung, as well as Sony, have realized that we're spending a lot more time at home through the pandemic. We care about what our appliances look and feel, and if they have functions that are as practical as they are impressive. Even with the very long purchase cycles for some of these appliances, there's enough there to attract a new batch of consumers. And I think the next slide goes into that a bit more from a screen technology perspective, where Samsung debuted a new Family Hub Plus on-fridge touchscreen, and even a camera on the inside of one of their new ovens that allows influencers to stream what they are baking in real time. And although I think that sounds pretty whimsical, there probably are more than a handful of baking influencers who can monetize such footage.
I mean, 100%, Michael, more than a handful. Like, there are so many that I think would love this. And the other announcement I thought that was really cool, Samsung's doing this, LG's doing this too, but from a connected consumer standpoint too, is like, if you think about how the rise of things like Hulu and now Netflix has their ad platform. We think about reaching consumers. You have to buy ads on Hulu, you have to buy ads on Spotify, so on and so forth. But now Samsung and LG, they're releasing these new connected ecosystem advertising platforms. So again, like we're going to joke about the things that influencers will film, which is literally everything. But imagine if like you're watching your favorite influencer, they've got their camera going in their oven, like then you have it's connected to your TV experience and you get conquesting ads for like a competitive product than something that you saw on the influencer feed. So the rise of these technologies too to make targeting smarter, better, and faster, but also remove some of the kind of middleman and complexity, I also found really interesting that is where Samsung and LG were doing a lot of announcements at CES.
Yeah, so the implications of it flipping from like a hardware-based conversation, because over the years we've seen curved TVs, we've seen TVs that roll up, we've seen 3D TV, like not all these technologies survive. So now that we're seeing these primary manufacturers focus so much on the software, I mean, that can only help marketers do things like targeting and doing active segmentation with the way that they can, some of them claim to be able to sense the people in the room. So we're only going to see more specific and granular ways of targeting over time based on the focus on software and how robust those feature sets are. So in terms of main takeaways, pragmatism and utility are bringing tech we've talked about for years into everyday life, including the metaverse. Personalization for personalization's sake, and innovation for innovation's sake is giving a way for streamlined consumer experiences and smarter uses of data. Personal data autonomy and understanding is making a way into health tech, driving a new wave of innovation. Sustainability is increasingly at the center of technology conversations, whether it's about manufacturing, recycling, even down to the R&D, introducing new products that are sustainable or will have entire companies claiming that they'll be net zero emissions by 2030. And TV hardware is evolving to support a robust streaming ecosystem, creating a new power dynamic in the industry and advertising landscape, as we just spoke about. So thank you so much for going over time, everyone. And I know that there must be a few questions lingering. We'll make our best effort to address them after the fact, but that is it.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Definitely we'll address questions afterwards. So Michael and I will follow up.
Great.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.